Binyamin. Yosef's Binyamin's dramatic power as a character is that he never says a word, right? And saying a lot gets you noticed, but so does saying absolutely nothing, because you realize it's essential to who he is that he never speaks in the Torah. Now, you could say we only hear from three brothers, right? We only hear from Reuven, Yehuda, and Yosef. And that's true. We don't hear from Yisachar or Naphtali or plenty of other brothers. But the story revolves at several points around Binyamin, and we still don't hear about him. The other brothers just appear as, you could say, the chorus, the group of brothers. Binyamin is a fairly major character, but he never speaks. And I just want to be clear about what never speaks means. When the whole family is debating whether or not Binyamin should be taken down to Egypt to free Shimon from jail and buy no food, Binyamin doesn't say a word. Binyamin is a father of 10. We think of him as a little boy because his brothers call him Na'ar. And he doesn't say, I have to get food for my kids, right? He doesn't say, no one has to be responsible for me. I'll be responsible for myself. And when the cup is found in his bag, again, he doesn't say a word. He doesn't say, I'm innocent. He doesn't say, I'm guilty. And when his brothers tear their clothes and all mount up to go back to Egypt with me, he doesn't say, you all have to come. And he doesn't say, I need you. He's simply silent. And when Yehuda offers to be a slave for the rest of his life in his place, again, not a word. And when he hears that his brothers sold Yosef into slavery, at the moment that Yosef reveals himself, there's the shock that his dead brother's alive, but he also had no idea of the episode at Dotan, and he doesn't say a word. He does cry bitterly on Yosef. So it's not that he doesn't have feeling. And so many midrashim have grown up around that crying. And I think it's because it's the only self-expression that we have from Binyamin. And lately I've been watching The Crown on Netflix. I don't know if you have. So I dislike them one and all, but I can't turn my gaze away. And I was thinking of Binyamin when I was watching the final episode this week. And I thought the ideal in the palace and the crown is for all members of the royal family to be silent, to see themselves as little cogs in the machinery. Of course, normally a queen would speak, but this queen, she's part of a democracy. But I imagine in royal houses, there's the official line and everyone else is required to be quiet. And it's not easy. There's no room for self-expression, right? It drives Princess Margaret and Prince Charles up the wall that they can't speak. Binyamin does not seem to chafe. Maybe that's my imagination. But I think there must be royals who are comfortable with their role of keeping quiet and just being a little part of the whole. In other words, there must be royals who can see themselves as objects, not as subjects. And in our story, Binyamin is an object. And that, I think, is why he doesn't talk. And I hope he's okay with it. I like to think that he is. It's not the worst thing in the world. In what sense is he an object? He's the replacement Yosef. He is the stand-in for Yosef. sadly, over the years, a number of times in my class or in my school, we've lost a child, lo aleinu, and the parents have another child. And in every case that I've known about, the parents have been wise enough not to name the new child for the one who passed away, because it's a terrible burden to be the replacement. But Binyamin, it's so explicit, I think, that he's the replacement. And you can, when Yehuda's talking to Yosef about replacing Binyamin, this is some of what he says. He says, our father told us, Yidatem kishnayim yaldali ishti. You know my wife, of course, Rachel, he's ignoring the others, gave birth to two. Vayetze ha'echad meiti, and the first, or the only one, left me. Va'omar ach tarof toraf, and I told myself he's torn to pieces. V'lo ri'iti vadhena, I haven't seen him since. Ulakachtem gam et ze me'im panai, ukra'ahu ason v'oradatem et sevati bi'agon she'ola. And if you take this one from me, I'll die. He doesn't say if you take Binyamin. If you take this one from me, I'll die. His sort of fierce clinging to Yosef's replacement, I think, must have been a great burden to Yosef and evident to all the brothers. No one discusses whether or not Binyamin is entitled to an opinion. No one thinks Binyamin is a full person. He's the Yosef replacement. And it's not as if Yaakov didn't recognize the dangers of burdening a child with a death. Because when Rachel gave birth to him, she died in childbirth. But before she expired, she named the child, and she named him Ben Oni, son of my suffering. And Yaakov couldn't let, all his children were named by their mothers, except for Binyamin. He knew that you can't have a child named Ben Oni, and so he renamed him Binyamin, son of the right, which is really, it means the literal right, but also virtue. And he didn't want his son Binyamin to be associated with his mother's death. And yet, apparently, he just refrained from associating, if you don't mind, mute everyone. He couldn't refrain from associating him with Yosef. It seems to me Yaakov has this issue, which I guess there are others who have. He can only intensely love one or two at a time. It wasn't really cut out, at least at first, to be the father of Kahalamim, a community of tribes. He only picked one wife. And he can only focus on her, and then only on her children, and especially on her first child. And maybe it was painful to associate Binyamin with the death, but in an odd way, Binyamin is the new favorite, and his brothers have good reason to be jealous of him. But from his point of view, he's in exactly the same position as the other brothers, which is lower in his father's heart than Yosef. There's no question, if Yosef could reappear on the scene, Binyamin wouldn't be anything special. And that, in fact, happens when they're in Mitzrayim. We have conversations between Yaakov and Yosef, and Binyamin is out of the picture completely. And I know, because the text tells us that Yosef loved Binyamin. I'm curious how Binyamin felt about Yosef, right? Yosef was something between 8 and 9, maybe 10, when Binyamin was born and Rachel died. So there's a big age gap. And if Yosef left home at 17, Binyamin was 7, 8, 9, something like that. So we really don't know if it was a two-way relationship. But I think this silent Binyamin is the replacement Yosef. He's a kind of an object. And I wonder if his descendants, which would be Shaul and Esther, are in some sense also objects like that. I don't know, but I've been wondering about it. Maybe you have some ideas. So now let's go to Yosef and Yaakov. So we've talked so much about them. I'd like to come at it from a different angle and start by pointing out that Yosef never suffered from the replacement syndrome, which is what I'm naming it. I don't know if that's the right thing, in the way Binyamin did. He might have, right, with the death of Rachel, Yosef might have been the favored one because he's Rachel's son. And most people who haven't looked at the text carefully assume that is why Yosef was favored. He was Rachel's son, the one that came without his mother dying in his birth. But in fact, Yaakov's favoring him has nothing to do with Rachel. And it may well have preceded her death, because the Torah tells us exactly why he was favored. V'Yisrael ahav et Yosef mikol banav, ki ven zekunim hu lo lamed aleph, to him, for him. Yaakov loved Yosef more than his other sons because Yosef was his ben zekunim. We'll talk about what that means in a minute, but it was because of a bond between Yaakov and Yosef, nothing to do with Rachel, right? That Yosef was his favorite. So you might remember from way back in 3rd or 4th grade that the Midrash offers a few possibilities for what a ben zekunim is. Well, why is that necessary? Ben zekunim is a known phrase. It means a child who's born to a father when the father is old. But the problem is that he was still older when Binyamin was born. So Rashi says, so what? He was still old. It could have the usual meaning. And others come to help Rashi out and say, not just that, he associated Binyamin with Rachel's death. But it seems like a pretty superficial reason to favor, although I know people favor for superficial reasons, but this is Yaakov Avinu. So the next answer proposed by the Midrash and quoted by Rashi is equally improbable. He favored him because he looked the same. That view takes ben zekunim, Ben's son, and split zikunim into 2 words, ziv ikunim, which is an idiom that means face. His face was like his, and it appears many times in Midrash Rabbah that their faces were the same, which is odd because he's called Yefei Toar v'Yefei Mar'eh. And Rachel is described as Yefat Toar v'Yefat Mar'eh. It seems more likely that he took physically after his mother. Of course, you can look like both. But I think that constant repetition that they have the same ziv ikunim is, although it does literally mean face, must be trying to suggest that they have the same experience and the same story. And the third option, which seems like a more likely reason, but it has a big linguistic problem. And since Rashi proposes it last, in all likelihood, it's his first choice. And he says that Yaakov managed to teach Yosef all the, let's put it in quotes, Torah that he knew. We're not going to go into how the Midrash envisioned what the body of Jewish knowledge was and how it was passed on at that time. But however it was, Rashi says, Yosef was his star pupil. They had a meeting of the minds. That's why they were close. But what does Ben Zekunim have to do with star pupil? So Ramban, with an N, Nachmanides, comes and helps Rashi out and says, there is a role of a kind of a star pupil that really could be called a Ben Zekunim and occurs again and again in Tanakh. And that's the young man who's the aide, the assistant to the great old man, but who also is privileged to learn from the old man and have a relationship with him. And we have plenty of B'nai Zekunim in that meaning. So for Ramban, it means Ben, young man, Zekunim, with an old man, the young man who serves the old man. And he says you have it with Yoshua and Moshe, you have it with Shmuel and Eli HaKohen, and he's of the opinion you probably have it later on with Ephraim and his grandfather Yaakov. So at an earlier stage, Yosef was his father's Ben Zekunim. And those of you who live in Bergen County and probably other places too, know of rabbis and teachers who had the privilege to be the Ben Bayit, sort of Ben Zekunim of Rav Soloveitchik alav hashalom. And it's a core element of who they are. If you hear what they did, some of it sounds so mundane. They ran things off on the copying machine and they picked them up at the airport and they brought up food from the cafeteria and they answered the phone and told people whether or not he was available, that sort of thing. But in fact, they had a contact with him that changed who they were because of the remarkable man that he was. Changed the kind of rabbis they would be, how they would answer halachic questions, how they would deal with people. And they had a closeness with him, which the other students might have wanted but couldn't have. So Ramban says Yosef was a Ben Zekunim in that sense. He served his father, some of it negative, perhaps, like bringing reports on others, but he became his father's Talmud, which had lots of signals that this would be the father's heir. And when on top of being Ben Zekunim, he got the ketona that sent the brothers round the bend. So the Torah gives a reason for favoring Yosef, and it's a mystery. But let's say they have this special bond. So how does the Yosef story start? With the most bizarre pasuk, really. Eile toldo Yaakov Yosef is how it starts. This is the history, or these are the progeny of Yaakov, Yosef. And then it goes on to say Yosef was 17 years old, et cetera, but that doesn't make sense. Eile toldot is a very common phrase in the Torah. It either means here are the episodes or the events, as in creation, Eile toldot hashamayim v'haaretz behibaram. These are the events of heaven and earth when they were created. Or Eile toldot this one, Eile toldot that one. And what we get is the family tree. So what's Eile toldot Yaakov Yosef? So I'm going to share it with you so you can see. This is the Rashi on those words. Here he writes, Eila Toldot Yaakov. And sometimes it's even printed, Eila Toldot Yaakov Yosef. But without a doubt, Rashi's question is, why following Eila Toldot do we not either have a list of all Yaakov's progeny or the telling of the events of Yaakov's life? So Rashi first answers, Siba Rishona Yosef ben 17, blah, 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 Yedei Zeni Kel Galu v'Yardu l'Mitzrayim. So he said, well, what do you mean? Just because Yosef's name is in here, this is a crucial part of Yaakov's life. He's supposed to be the one of the Avot in whose generation we go down to Egypt. Yosef is a key player in getting us to Egypt. We have no problem here. And really, pshat-wise, that's Rashi's answer. But he says, if you want to know what the Midrash says about it, the Midrash says that Yaakov's story is attached to Yosef's story for a few reasons, right? Why didn't it just start with the Yosef story? Why did you have to stick in Eila Toldot Yaakov? So the Midrash says, we want to offer three reasons. The one, Shekol Atzmo Shel Yaakov Lo Avad Eitzel Lavan Ela Berachel, right? So we've just had him working in Lavan's house, and they've come back to Israel with a few adventures on the way. So he said, this is the proper sequel to he was in Lavan's house. All his efforts in Lavan's house were for one thing, Yosef. I beg your pardon, weren't they all for Rachel? So if you look back in the Chumash, Rashi tricks Yaakov into working a total of 14 years for Leah ben Rachel. At the end of those 14 years, it lists that Yosef was born, and then Yaakov goes to Lavan and says, I'm ready to go now. So the Midrash says, you see, he was going to leave Lavan's house when Yosef was born. All this effort was so that Rachel could have a child, and that was Yosef, and that's why it's appropriate now that the Yaakov story focuses on Yosef. The number two answer from the Midrash is, here we go again, his face looked like his face. But number three is the one that I highlighted. Whatever happened to Yaakov happened to Yosef. The biography of Yaakov and the biography of Yosef are virtually identical, is what the Midrash is saying. And it gives you some examples. Zeni stam v'zeni stam. He was hated and he hated, right? Both Yaakov and Yosef. Zachiv mevakesh lehorgo v'ze'echav mevakshim lehorgo. Yaakov, his brother, wanted to kill him, and Yosef, his brothers, wanted to kill him. And it says there are many more examples of Breshit Rabbah. Now, I guess you could take almost any two characters in the Torah and find some similarities, but there really are a lot here. And when we would learn this Rashi in my class, I would give the kids for extra credit an opportunity to, if they want to look it up in Breshit Rabbah and find the other, I think Breshit Rabbah lists 10, if I'm not mistaken, or come up with other similarities yourselves, and they would find so many. So we're not going to look at every possibility, but what I did was collected ones that in some ways could have made them not the same person as the Midrash is saying, but I don't think they mean it literally, but formed them into similar people who really got each other. So, in other words, there is sort of an ultimate example of the principle Ma'aseh Avot Siman Levanim, right? The experiences of the fathers can almost predict the experiences of the children. So they were both favorite sons in, I guess you would say, an unwholesome way, right? And part of the favoritism had to do with knowing that this is the exceptional and possibly chosen one among the others. So Rivka recognized Yaakov as the chosen. It was simple. She had a nevuah. Yitzchak didn't recognize him. So he is both a favorite son and an unbeloved son at the same time, right? Yosef's father seems to wait for the dream to be realized, and his Ben Zakuni knows there's something special about him. But since Rachel dies young, he's also kind of missing one parent. They both, of course, leave Israel due to their brother's hostility, which means they're really our first two diaspora Jews. They have that in common, right? Because Yehuda leaves the family, but he stays in Israel. And it's true, Avram and Sarah went down to Mitzrayim, but that's not the same thing as moving to the diaspora. They got into a little trouble, got some food and money, and came home. But Yosef and his father really experienced diaspora, and they are the first two characters in Torah to exhibit a longing for Eretz Canaan, right? Yitzchak was prepared to leave no problem. Yaakov really doesn't want and hesitates, and each of the men on their deathbeds beg to be buried in Israel. They both have the full diaspora experience, which means it's not easy for a Jew in Galus, right? So Lavan is constantly ripping off Yaakov, and Potiphar's wife is doing everything she can to bring down Yosef. And they die in diaspora. So you all, with Abraham, the place over there is where you leave. Yaakov does go over there, but it's never envisioned as permanent. But there's this thing in the air that Avram's been told, Ger yeh zaracha be'eretz lo lahem, right? They're going to be suffering in another place, and then they'll get Eretz Yisrael. Rav Soloveitchik had the idea that Yaakov believed that that's what his time in Lavan's house represented, that was what was foretold to Abraham. Well, you'll say, what about the Arbamot Shana? I can't explain that, but that we're all always interpreting our own lives. And he interpreted that he was the generation that suffered, and his kids would be the generation to get the land. And as often happens when you think the suffering's all over, then it started to get really tough, right? Then he lost Rachel, then he lost Yosef, and in the end, they'll all be slaves and so forth. What I think, I think they both knew that they were men of destiny, and that their destiny was that they had a special place in God's plan. And so to whatever degree you want to define it, they are both Nevi'im. Of course, Yaakov has more experiences, and he also hears Hashem's word. Yosef only sees the images of the dream. But Hashem does help him interpret other dreams. And I think what they have in common that none of the others have in the family is they have the loneliness of the Navi, the experience that they cannot share, but is the central experience of their lives. Their like moment of contact with Hashem, that flash of saying, this is what I'll be unraveling for the rest of my life. And it's almost impossible to talk about. Yosef tries, he gets shot down. I don't know if Yaakov discussed it with Rachel or Yosef with Osnat, but in my mind, they're both pretty lonely men because that's part of being a Navi. And the final thing they have in common, in my opinion, and I'm pretty sure every official commentary would disagree, so you don't have to buy it. I think they make each other's dreams come true, right? In our first session, I tried to sell you my opinion that Yosef's mission was to make Yaakov's dream of the ladder come true, where it's foretold that Yaakov won't have one descendant who leads, but that all of his descendants will be included in a community of tribes. So that's for Yosef helping Yaakov's dream come true, which is, I would say, the ultimate example of Kibud Av. But I think Yaakov also helped Yosef's dream come true, both in the kind of simple literal way, which is that at the end of his life, Yaakov bows to Yosef, right? Vayishtachu al rosh hamita, which I think we had on the screen another day, which could easily be explained in that spot. He's thanking him for giving him, for swearing that he'll bury him in Eretz Yisrael. But it is very unusual for a father to bow to a son. So for that reason, commentaries come and say, this is one of the sources of the respect that's due a melech, that a Jew has to give kavod to a legitimate ruler, including if it's his own son. But I like to think Yaakov knew the second dream. Yosef had told it to him. And he was doing his part before he died to help his son's dream come true, and he bowed. But he could have done it earlier. And I think that's because he had some other work to do first, or to prepare first. He actually utters it after he bows, when he makes the brachot. And that is to give each son a tribe and each son a bracha, which is a different world than what he imagined. The youth was struggling over the bracha, which of course it turns out that probably there were two brachot, and I'm sure you've all heard that he didn't need to tangle with Esau. And still again, this natural tendency in him to glom on to one, he's giving it to Yosef. And now he seems to have attached himself to Binyamin. And then somehow in his time in Egypt, in the experience of Yehuda, having that remarkable conversation with his father when he pledges to bring Binyamin back. In his reunion with Yosef, he comes to a different place. He splits the Bechorah 3 ways. He gives everyone a bracha. And most remarkable, if you look at the brachot, he seems to actually know his sons. And I think a part of him knows that Yosef engineered all that. And he is now doing his part. And so really, they're both helping each other's dreams come true. And to me, it's all sort of encapsulated in the beautiful words, which are part of Yaakov's last interactions with Yosef, when he says, Yadati b'ni yadati. I know, my son, I know. Of course, there's a technical thing that they're dealing with. Yaakov is going to bless Yosef's sons, Ephraim and Menashe, and he has his hands like this. And we all know the right hand gives the big bracha, and it's on the head of the younger, Ephraim. And Yosef is very displeased with this. Yosef is for rules and not for meritocracy. He suffered too much from it. He doesn't want favoring. He doesn't want choices that are personal. The Bechor should get the right hand. Let the Bechor get the right hand, regardless of who he is. And his father says, Yadati, although my vision is poor, I know that my right hand is on the younger one. And he goes on to explain that they're both going to be great, but the younger will be greater. And so it's a prophetic thing that he has to put the right hand on the younger. But he says Yadati twice. And then the word bini is in the middle, right? And I think he's saying, not only do I know how it has to be now and why it bothers you, I know a lot about what's going on, even though you haven't shared things and we haven't said a lot of things directly. I get it. And I think the word bini tells you that. To me, it has an echo of the Akedah, right? Elokim Yireli et Hasela Ola Bini. Avram going with Yitzchak, and they call each other Avi and Bini. And to me, that Yadati Bini Yadati is what you want when your parent is dying, right? There's so many closenesses and gaps between the generation. Like the more the closeness, the more painful the gaps. In this family, it was like off the charts. And if at the end of the life, without spelling everything out, you can say Yadati b'ni Yadati, I think you're doing all right. How have I that I could do well like that with my own kids? Now, this connection between the two of them is the Midrash finds it in one rare word, and that word is vayima'ain. He refused. It's a rare word in the Torah, and it's used to describe something that Yaakov does and something that Yosef does. So when Yaakov sees the bloody coat, it says in the first paragraph up on the screen, Vayikra Yaakov simlotav, vayasem sak b'motnav, vayitabel al beno yamim rabim, right? He tears his clothes, dresses himself in sackcloth, and mourns his son for a very long time. And his children, who know what's happened to Yosef possibly, are really uncomfortable. Vayakumu kol banav v'chol benotav lenachamo. And all his kids rose up to try to comfort him. Vayima'ain lehitnachem. And he refused to be comforted. Vayima'ain, he refused. Vayomer ki ered el b'ni avel she'ola. And he said, I'm going to mourn my son until I'm in the grave with him. And he cried on him. So that's our first Vayima'ain. Yaakov refuses to be comforted. Our next one is when Mrs. Potiphar tries to get Yosef to lie down with her. And it says, Vayhi achar hadvarim ha'ele vatisa eshet Adonav et eineha el Yosef. And after these things, his master's wife lifted up her eyes and saw Yosef and said, Shichvaini, lie down with me. Vayima'en. And he refused. Not easy for a slave to refuse a free Egyptian woman. But he decides not to sin and also possibly to risk his life. Now here's a close-up of the second Vayima'en. And you can see it has a shalshelet. Do we have any laners here who can read it for us with a shalshelet? Unmute yourself and read it. No volunteers? Well, I know. Yeah? Can you, Jeff? Go ahead.
I'll try.
Good. Yishar kochacha. Right. It's a three. It's the note of struggle. Yaakov didn't struggle on his Vayima'en. He couldn't be comforted. But at almost the same time, just a little later in the text, we have Yosef refusing also. And the Midrash sees that as a thread between the father and the son. And it's easy to understand why Yaakov wasn't comforted and refused to be comforted, because he couldn't achieve any level of acceptance. There was no body. He was the father of an MIA. It's terrible to be the parent of a child whose dead body comes home from war, but in some ways it's worse to be the parent of an MIA because you can never come to terms. You're always hoping. So that is probably an element of it. And the beautiful way that it's stated, and I think in the Gemara, but I'm not positive, Ein adam mekabel tanchumin al hachai. A person cannot receive comfort for the living. In other words, if you think someone's dead and you're mourning them and they're actually alive, you can't get comfort. That passage sees nechama as a gift from Hashem, just like refuah is a gift from Hashem. And of course, we know refuah doesn't come in every situation. And this is explaining that there are also certain situations where nechama, which is a natural process and a gift from God, can't come if the child is still alive. And I wondered if part of his clinging, although he says he knows Yosef is dead, on the other hand, he knows about that dream. And if he thinks it's a dream similar to his own dream of the ladder, he may feel Hashem will make it come true. But what about Yosef's Vayima'en? It's true, it's the same word, but is that enough to make the link? So the Midrash, which I imagine many of you are familiar with, which is my all-time favorite. To me, it's the Midrash about what education really is. Yosef is very tempted. He's tempted out of fear, and he's tempted because of her seduction. And he glances up, and Vayima'en, of course, Jeff did it much better, which is he refused, the Midrash said, because he saw his father's image in the window. In other words, he refused because he was Yaakov's son. He refused because the image of Yaakov was more in front of him than that sexy woman and that powerful woman. The Midrash is saying, in halacha, it's a good when you see the same words. But in Parshanut, I don't know if it has a name, but it's the same idea. If the word is here and the word is there, there's a link, there's a bond. And that is this special bond between them. And just to wrap it up, because I do want this time to give you a chance to talk, before we leave Yosef, after I've told you all these far out things that are my idea, here's my last one. I think Yosef may have evolved from his father's son to his mother's son and back to his father's son. I do think children go through phases like that, but I think the language of the text hints, I'm not saying says explicitly, that happened. Because the first time we hear about the relationship, we hear Yaakov ahavet Yosef mikol banav ki ben zekunim hulo. They had this connection of ben zekunim, which may be he's a special student, but whatever it means, it's between the father and the son, and it's the reason for his loving Yosef so much. And then Yosef goes to Mitzrayim. He knows his brothers have turned against him. He only much later learns that Reuben stood up for him. And he doesn't know where his father is in that story. His father scolded him, not a usual experience. Scolded him when he told him his precious dream, and then sent him off. And Yosef must have at times thought, this was a plan between my father and my brothers. Or at least father didn't try too hard to keep me safe. He saw they hate me, and he sent me right into their hands. And Hashem is with him in Mitzrayim, right? The classic story about how everything can go wrong, that God is still with you. He is a slave, but he's a house slave, not a field slave. He is a slave, but he has a decent master. He is a slave, but he goes higher and higher in the house. He doesn't suffer as most slaves happen. And then everything comes crashing down. And again, he winds up in a pit. And he himself calls the jail, which he's thrown into because of the Mrs. Potiphar episode, a bore, a pit. He sees it happening again. But Rashi has a very rigid view regarding all the episodes of Yosef's life. That is that every up and down can be identified as reward or punishment from Hashem. And he also has a principle, I don't know if you're familiar with it, about Achar HaDvarim Ha'ela. Raise your hand if you know it already. So I hope I won't bore those who do, but Rashi says that when you see Achar HaDvarim Ha'ela in the text, after these things, it does not mean that this is the next thing that happened chronologically. Because if that were so, every single chapter would start with Achar HaDvarim Ha'ela. He says Achar HaDvarim Ha'ela implies causation, that the thing before the words Achar HaDvarim Ha'ela caused whatever happened after. So here's what it says regarding Eshet Potiphar. I'll share with you again and you can see it. Okay. Here we go. So the second paragraph, Vayehi achar hadvarim ha'ela. After these things, she started up with him. What comes in front of the Vayehi achar hadvarim ha'ela? Vayehi Yosef yefei toar v'fei mar'eh. Yosef was looking good, really good. And after that, she started up. So you could say, yeah, she always started up with handsome guys. But that's not going to be the Rashi approach. The Eshet Potiphar troubles have to be a punishment for a sin. So what's the sin in looking good? So when you see a redundancy, Vayehi achar hadvarim Yefei Torah v'Yefei Mareh, you can go in two directions. It's two kinds of handsome, or it means very, very handsome. So Rashi, I would say, goes in the direction of it's two different things. It means naturally handsome and, let's say, artificially handsome. That he was handsome, that's how he was born. But Rashi says, Avicha metabel v'ata ochel v'shotem v'salsel b'se'arecha. Your father is mourning you, right? Which of course Yosef doesn't know. But Rashi says, Avicha mitabel, your father is mourning you. V'ata ochel v'shotem v'salsel b'se'arecha. And you're eating and drinking and curling your hair. In other words, you're taking good care of yourself. You're getting nutrition. You're taking care of your grooming. Those are the exact opposite of mourning. That's being well adjusted in Mitzrayim. Outrageous, the Midrash Rashi quote says, and continues, Hashem says, Ani megareh b'cha hadov miyad. I'm going to release the bear, Mrs. Potiphar with her claws. Ani megareh b'cha hadov miyad. I'm going to sick the bear on you immediately. So whether or not you want to buy it as reward and punishment, there's no doubt that Yefei Torah v'Yefei Mareh is what Yosef has in similar to Rachel, who's Yefat Torah v'Yefat Mareh. And so I think that he was super close to his father. I assume he missed his mother, but she wasn't an influence on him. And anyhow, there are hints that she didn't have a wholesome attitude about motherhood. When Yosef is born, she says, Yosif li ben acher, let me have another child. Also like the crown, an heir and a spare, right? Which in the story really is what Binyamin turns out to be. But she's beautiful and she draws people to her. I imagine her as charismatic. And he seems to have that too. It may be helping him in his success in Egypt, that he's good looking and appealing. But that doesn't stay. When he gets close to the real corruption of Egypt, he reverts to the Yaakov model in Vayima'en. So that's why I say father, mother, father. Ben Zekunim Hula, Yefei Torah v'Yefei Mareh, and Vayima'en. I don't know if I'm right about that, but it's something I'd be interesting to hear what you think about all this. Unmute yourselves and don't be shy, please. We do have a little bit, well, we can make a little bit of time. I always talk too much. Nobody, come on.
Rachel, I want to go back to your idea about the dreams.
Okay.
Okay, and that Yosef and Yaakov are fulfilling each other's dream.
Yeah.
Does Yaakov somehow maybe believe that possibly Yosef is still alive because the second dream hasn't been fulfilled?
Yeah, so I said that I think that's a possibility. There are little hints, either that he thinks the brothers are guilty of killing him, or that he suspects the brothers know what happened, right? He says, Baderech asher halachtam ba, right? That sort of thing. I think it's possible, but the truth is a poor parent whose child doesn't come back probably is all, even without dreams, finds reasons that it couldn't be so, I imagine.
I think that at the very end of Yaakov's life, he's still learning and admitting error. And I think that we had before Ela Toldot Yaakov Yosef.
Right.
But in Vayechi, he gives the brachot to his children in order.
Right.
And Yosef and Binyamin are actually at the end. And so he's like, these are my children, and this is basic order according to their mothers, and I'm now whole with that. This is some finality to that in the way he gives the brachot.
Right. I love that idea. I agree with that. And I like that you said that he's still learning. There is that. He's not an easy person, but he's capable of growth right up to the end. Yeah.
I want to make just one more other point.
Sure.
The Benjamin, the silent, in the bracha, he's compared to a devouring wolf. You know, it's quite the opposite of the silent.
It's true. I was thinking the same thing today. What an odd, the opposite.
Right. Okay, that was just my thoughts. There are a million things, but
Yeah, well,
this has been wonderful. I thank you so much.
Thank you. These stories are so intriguing. You never get tired of them, or at least I don't. I guess I'm not supposed to say that.
I agree.
Okay, no one else wants to say so. Good night. Keep warm. And God willing, see you next week.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you,
Thank
Rachel.
you very
Thank
much.
you
Very
very much,
Rachel.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel.
Good evening, everyone.
Bye
Thank you.
bye. Take
Thank you.
care.
Thank
Good night.